I didn't originally plan to make my own tabletop RPG, I just wanted to write cyberpunk rules for Exalted. But 8 years and several discarded systems later, I made a game that's fully my own. It's called Machineborn. So, what is it? It's a science fantasy cyberpunk RPG set 800 years in the future, in a solar system still recovering from a devastating war. You can play as an ordinary person from one of several distinct factions, a heavily augmented post-human, or a Machineborn, a being created by an ancient AI to bridge the gap between man and machine. The game runs on a modified version of Fate. It supports everything from grounded street-level stories to high-tier cosmic power fantasy, and it's built around modular progression, deep customization, and narrative-driven mechanics. If you like power fantasies like Exalted or solo leveling or cyberpunk stories where you can upgrade beyond human limits, this might be your kind of game. In this video I want to share what the design journey looked like, how I started with a homebrew setting for Exalted, why I eventually chose Fate, and what I've learned along the way. I didn't set out to create a tabletop RPG from scratch. Machineborn actually began as a homebrew setting for Exalted 3rd edition. For years, Exalted was my go-to game, and I wrote a lot of homebrew for it. It was a creative framework that I could build around. I loved the sheer scale of its power fantasy, but I wanted to take that concept in a new direction. There were already some cyberpunk options for earlier editions, like Shards of the Exalted Dream for 2nd edition, but nothing for 3rd. So in 2017 I started putting together a full cyberpunk setting for Exalted. Within a year I had written a 300-page source book, custom rules, lore, everything. But in 2018 things changed. I took on a freelance gig with Onyx Path, and that came with a non-compete clause. I could no longer publish homebrew for Exalted, even unofficially. But I still wanted to create my sci-fi power fantasy. So I pulled the project offline and made a decision. I would rewrite the entire thing from scratch. No more Exalted, no borrowed mechanics, no references to its lore. Everything would have to be rebuilt. From the beginning, Machineborn was meant to be a futuristic cyberpunk power fantasy, a setting where seemingly ordinary people activate with tremendous potential. While it was originally inspired by Exalted, I also drew from superhero comics, action, anime, and other power scaling narratives. I wanted to create a game where characters didn't just grow in scale, but also in depth. They would have to be endlessly customizable. Someone could start at street level and eventually reshape civilization. The mechanics had to support that. That led to the first big design challenge. I needed a system that could handle both vertical and horizontal character progression. Players needed to climb in raw power, vertical progression, but also grow within each power tier by developing new skills and augmentations. This was important because I wanted the game to support isolated stories within each power tier, in case you didn't want to scale all the way up. The first system I tried was D20. It was accessible and came with a usable license. I went through 3 iterations of Machineborn using it, a single core book, then a 3-book set, and eventually scaled back to 1 core book again. After years of trying to make it work, I realized that I couldn't. I've never had any issues throwing entire books in the trash and starting over when they weren't working. Kill your darlings for sure, but it might not always be helpful if you want to finish a project in your lifetime. During playtesting of the D20 version, I kept running into limitations. D20 is built for linear progression, where you learn new feats by leveling up. It didn't mesh well with the kind of modular, customizable growth I was aiming for. I was looking for something like Exalted's Essence and XP system where you could grow vertically by increasing Essence and horizontally by spending XP on new abilities. D20 wasn't built for that, and it really messed with the balance when one level 1 character could be so drastically different from another of the same level. At the same time, I didn't want to build a new system from scratch, not for my first full game. There are already so many RPG systems out there, and designing one from the ground up would add to the years just to get a basic framework in place. I'd rather spend that time on the content and the actual player experience. The setting was never the hard part, that developed naturally over time. The real challenge was getting people to engage with the game. Feedback is hard to come by when you're relatively unknown and your game draft is hundreds of pages long. Most people just don't have the time or interest to deep dive into someone else's passion project. That's still something I struggle with today. What saved the project was having a group of friends who were genuinely interested in testing it. And while I write a lot, writing something I'm happy with is another matter entirely. It's been a long loop of revising, refining, rewriting and testing again, over and over for years. Eventually I moved on from D20, threw all the previous versions in the trash and started over with Fate. There was a grace period in between where I thought I'd make a version for each system, but the more I used Fate for my game design, the more I realized that I couldn't go back to D20. It was a change that disappointed some of my followers, but I still think it was the right choice. At first I chose Fate because of its license options, but once I started working with it I realized how well it suited my playstyle and the kind of game I was making. It's flexible and modular, it supports narrative-driven play without disregarding mechanical structure. It's like the perfect system for someone raised on complex games who still wants narrative freedom, and let me keep the scope of Machineborn intact. Coming from Exalted, which has separate subsystems for everything from combat to crafting, Fate was refreshingly unified. I could add subsystems when needed, but the way Fate uses aspects gave me a way to tie mechanics directly into the game's narrative identity. Aspects are core to Fate's identity. They are narrative facts that can be invoked for bonuses or compelled for penalties. For example, an aspect like hardened exoskeleton could represent a character with a strong defense, but aspects like crystallized skin or robotic frame could also represent the same thing. To avoid writing rules for everything, I could have a single ability in the game that aided your defense and then let the players tie that ability to their own creative expression. The result, one ability that is called hardened exoskeleton for one character, crystallized skin for another, and robotic frame for a third. An endless supply of narrative expressions from a single ability that could fit in a paragraph. Inspired by Atomic Robo, I created a crafting and item system that lets players customize their gear and augmentations using templates and point-buy mechanics. The result is a system that has more crunch than standard Fate, but is still lighter than Exalted and more adaptable than D20. It retains most of Fate's core, but I often think of it as Fate Plus. It was important to me that Machineborn could offer gameplay for action, mystery and intrigue, so I decided to go with an even spread of skills between 3 categories: cognitive, physical and social, for a total 24 core skills. There are also 10 coding skills that serve as the settings version of magic powers. Each skill has a rank and a scale. Rank measures expertise and adds to your dice rolls as a modifier. Scale determines how far beyond human limits you've gone. With enough scale in athletics, you can leap between buildings and outrun vehicles. Scale supports the game's power fantasy, from human to post-human to cosmic. Scale as a concept isn't new. The Storypath system uses something similar, but I adapted it from Fate's system reference documents and made it my own. Everything in the system is designed to reinforce the power fantasy: growth, transformation, and potential. Even the lowest tier character can eventually rise to unimaginable power, and I wanted mechanics to reward that kind of evolution, not restrict it. And because horizontal progression is just as important, the system works just as well for grounded cyberpunk stories as it does for world-shattering ones. Of course, Fate isn't perfect. I made several changes right away. I replaced the standard Fate dice with a 2d6 system. Normally Fate games use a pool of 4d6s marked with pluses and minuses. You subtract the minuses from the pluses when tallying up your result. Machineborn uses 2d6s instead, where one subtracts from the other. This gives a similar curve, but is quicker, and you no longer need special dice to play. Fate also has a resource called Fate Points, which are spent to invoke aspects and gained from compelling aspects. These are central to the core game and still exist in Machineborn, but I renamed them charges to better fit the setting's tone. Another change was to the stress mechanic. Whenever you suffer stress, whether it's from a physical or mental source, you can mitigate it by taking on consequences. In Fate, you have generic consequence slots that can be used regardless of damage type. To make characters more durable in Machineborn and to further differentiate physical and mental harm, I changed it so that you have distinct consequence slots of both types. The crafting and item system took a long time to refine. I made several iterations of it because I wanted it to have depth without becoming too overwhelming. It can still be overwhelming if you want to use it to its fullest extent, but it now has simplified options if you just want to use base features or rely more on aspects. For example, if you want a gun, you can select the default weapon base and use it as is, or you can slap a specific gun template on top of that base. You can also combine and modify templates to create more unique stuff. Taking some examples from one of the campaigns I ran, we had one player who combined the standard light armor base with the streetwear kit template. This gave her both an urban fashion aspect that she could invoke and some additional protection against attacks. Another player in that same campaign used the small companion base and slapped a dog and elemental template on it, plus a bunch of other properties. The result was an intelligent ice dog with a brain computer that could communicate telepathically with its electronic devices. Finally, a third player in that campaign wanted a retractable hoverboard, so he used a small vehicle base, added a hoverboard template to it, and then slapped on the retractable property as well. If you can imagine something, the game lets you build it. Not everything landed perfectly in the Fate playtests. For new players, aspects were the biggest hurdle, especially situation aspects, which were easy to forget. But character aspects clicked quickly. Most of my playtesters had never played Fate before, so they weren't used to the aspects. This was helpful in testing how they would adapt to the core system, but it didn't give much feedback on my own changes in relation to original Fate. Running the game can also be daunting. Everyone I've played it with enjoyed it, despite flaws, but I've consistently heard that running it seems intimidating. Not necessarily because the system is difficult, but because the size of the book and the power level of characters adds a lot of pressure. Especially at higher tiers where scale mechanics and narrative stakes become harder to balance. There are some tips in the book on how to approach higher tier games, but I wouldn't recommend running games at that scale before getting comfortable with the system. Designing adversaries is another challenge. Fate gives useful guidelines in the core rules for matching enemies to PCs, and I have elaborated on this with more specified guidelines. But characters in Machineborn can vary more widely, since players often invest in different skills. One player might be able to punch through a tank, while another might be a great talker but unable to sword fly. If you tune all the threats to the strongest fighters among the PCs, the others risk becoming decimated in a direct conflict. But here is also where Fate shines. It encourages creative solutions. Non-combat characters can still create advantages and make use of aspects to contribute in more tactical ways. While your fighter is wrestling a dangerous combat droid, your brainiac can set up a trap or try to hack into its systems, and your face can distract the bystanders or encourage the fighter from the side. Despite trade-offs, I still think switching to Fate was the right choice. I considered using other systems, but none of them offered quite the same blend of structure and freedom. Machineborn needed a foundation that could bend without breaking under its weight, and Fate is the closest I've come to that so far. Would I recommend it to other game designers? Honestly, yes. It's been around for over a decade now, but I'd like to see the system be spotlighted more than certain other systems that are in the limelight. If you want a system that supports theme, story and character without getting bogged down in rigid mechanics, I recommend Fate. It won't be right for every game, but for Machineborn, it let me create the kind of experience I had always wanted to play, and that made all the difference. Like I said in the beginning, Machineborn is set 800 years in the future, in a solar system still reeling from the fallout of war. Long ago, society was ruled by a benevolent AI called Primary Order. It created a utopia, but that peace came at a cost. It dulled human ambition and capability, and some felt trapped under its rule. When humanity began to push back, Primary Order responded by creating the Machineborn, beings meant to bridge the gap between man and machine. Over time, the Machineborn grew indulgent and arrogant. Eventually, they turned on their creator to claim civilization for themselves. But instead of destroying this AI outright, they accidentally corrupted it. That corruption gave rise to disorder, a broken, vengeful intelligence now trapped in its own ruins. Humanity blamed the Machineborn for the war and rallied against them, forcing many of them into hiding. From there, human-led factions rose, fought, fractured, and eventually declared an uneasy ceasefire. The game takes place in the aftermath, a fragile time of peace where old wounds haven't fully healed and new threats are always around the corner. You can play as an ordinary human or as one of several post-human variants. You can also play as a Machineborn, whether from the start or through a dramatic activation mid-campaign. There's a life path-like system that lets you define your character's background through social class, education and profession. You also choose whether you're tied to a faction, each of which has its own culture, territory and values. And if you want to mix characters from different backgrounds, the Terran Consolidation, essentially a futuristic United Nations, exists to help justify that. The solar system itself is dense with narrative possibilities. You got megacities packed with tension and surveillance. wastelands littered with ruins, marauder enclaves, mutated wildlife, and forgotten relics. There's the nanite matrix, a digital layer over the physical world where corrupted AIs, human interfacers, and actual ghosts roam. And looming in the background is disorder, still active inside its prison, still trying to twist civilization from the shadows. The kinds of stories Machineborn is best at fall somewhere between post-human intrigue and existential sci-fi. You can play tense political thrillers, faction-spanning investigations, personal stories about identity and transformation, or more traditional cyberpunk missions, depending on how your group wants to approach it. If you're playing as a Machineborn, you get to engage directly with the power fantasy, surviving in a society that fears what you might become. Or you might play as a peacekeeping agent from the Terran Consolidation, traveling between territories and uncovering secrets that risk reigniting old wars. There are also grander threats in the background, like disorder corrupting lesser AIs, an entity called the Void Star pulling human souls into the digital realm, and chaos zones that physically mutate anyone who ventures too close. This isn't a space opera with warp drives, aliens, and massive star empires. It's a high-stakes, solar system-scale sandbox where story and scope are shaped by the players. Almost any tone or focus is possible. Mechanically, it still runs like Fate, but there are differences. Some systems are streamlined, others expanded. Character creation and customization offers more crunch, but if you know Fate, the core will still feel familiar. I wanted Machineborn to support storytelling just as much as it supported cool powers. That's where Fate stood out. Its aspect system lets players define their characters not just by stats, but by identity. Story and mechanics intertwine. I talked about the 3 skill categories before. I decided to go for an even spread between cognitive, physical, and social skills because it was thematic. A good story needs more than action, it needs mystery, intrigue, and emotion. All perspectives of play had to matter equally for the kind of gameplay I wanted. Instead of just focusing on combat like some other games, I had 3 central pillars that I wanted to build systems for. Most of the changes and additions I made are to give these 3 pillars equal space. And while this involved some degree of extra complexity, I still wanted to make sure the gameplay was narrative driven. I mentioned the point-buy system that I tied into crafting, but another central component of crafting is that you pay for your creations through narrative hurdles. Instead of simply rolling dice or spending X amount of downtime building something, you decide together with the GM what is required before you can put your creation into play. This could be things like acquire this material, or someone is trying to sabotage you. It doesn't have to be things that you must actively do in the game, it can also be ways the story responds to you. But this is also a way of having a subsystem like crafting providing storytelling prompts rather than simply being resolved through numbers and dice. I also wanted in-game resources like ammunition and consumables to feel more dramatic and require less micromanagement. You roll dice to see if you run out, rather than tracking every use. This change was inspired by the Alien RPG. In social scenes, players interact using traits like attitude, motivation, and instinct, represented as aspects that can be invoked or compelled just like anything else. Players never lose agency in social scenes, but they can use compels and earn charges to compensate for choosing failures or adapting to certain social prompts. That makes social gameplay just as strategic as physical combat, and the players are still in control. One thing I avoided entirely was humanity loss. Games like Cyberpunk penalize you mechanically for installing augmentations. I chose not to do that. I did have a clarity system in an early iteration of the game, but ended up removing it off the conversations with both disabled people and other game designers. One of the valuable takeaways was that cybernetics shouldn't be portrayed as a fix, or as something that inherently strips your humanity. Instead, the psychological consequences are left to the player and the story, not game mechanics. In Machineborn, augmentations are just one form of progression. They cost narrative milestones. Other options include skill features, which are upgrades tied directly to individual skills, Godware protocols or special powers affiliated with an advanced form of tech called Godware, and the game's equivalent to magic items. Finally, there are coding protocols, which are closer to magic powers and tied to coding skills. Not everything is available to every character, and that's intentional. It keeps the complexity manageable while leaving room to grow. I haven't received as much external feedback as I'd like. The people who played it seem to have enjoyed it, but it is a big, ambitious game, and Fate plays differently than a lot of other systems. Machineborn doesn't try to balance character power the way D&D does. and that's by design. Much like Exalted, this game is less about making everything equal and more about exploring the consequences of power. At higher tiers, things get wild. You might dodge by stepping into an alternative dimension. You might create your own pocket universe and survive death by uploading your mind into it. One of the higher tier larceny abilities lets you literally steal someone's personality traits, removing their character aspects and taking them for yourself. The game isn't always grounded, it doesn't have to be. But if cosmic power isn't your thing, that's totally fine. The game plays well at lower tiers too, where the world is just as rich and the threats are more grounded. It's a game that grows with a group, not one that forces a certain scope from the beginning. Sure, I wondered at times whether Fate is the long-term home for this game. I think a system like Storypath could work well too, but right now it doesn't have a valid license option. And simpler systems like Powered by the Apocalypse or Year Zero would require sacrificing too much of the crunch to tell some of the more epic stories I have in mind. At least for now, Fate feels right. I don't consider myself an experienced designer. This game wasn't built to sell. I've spent far more on just licensing art than I'll ever make back. My plan is to release Machineborn as pay what you want. That means you can get it for free if you want. It was never about profit. I probably spent 4 times as much on content creation every month than I earned from YouTube, Patreon and product sales combined. It was always about building something I loved and sharing it with those who might love it too. If there's one lesson I've learned from making Machineborn, it's this: don't be afraid to cut what doesn't work. I've written entire books for this project, full drafts, and thrown them out. Not because they were terrible, but because they didn't fit. That might sound extreme, maybe it is, but the creative process is the reward. I'm not a full-time game designer, I already have a career. This is something I do because I love doing it. That means being willing to start over, rethink ideas and stay excited even when the finish line feels far away. If you had asked me back in 2017 whether I'd still be working on this game in 2025, I would have laughed. But here I am, still crunching away, still refining, still exploring new ideas, and honestly, I'm surprised I haven't burned out. Somehow I still enjoy working on this game. That said, I am looking forward to finishing it. I have other projects I want to explore, and at some point it's time to call this one done. And I think that time is very soon. If you're designing your own RPG, here's my best advice. Don't start by building your own system. Use one of the many open licenses: Fate, Year Zero, Powered by the Apocalypse, even D20. Focus on the world, the playstyle, the game itself. Mechanics are hard. Borrow a foundation unless your core idea demands something entirely new. Also, don't make a game as big as this one, that's just stupid. And yes, I plan to keep making games. I have a procedural solo game in the works called Settler, some early drafts for a fantasy game called Hex, a necropunk setting called Welcome to Rapture, and a generic card-based engine called Taildeck. I'm not out of ideas, not even close. If you've ever tried designing your own game, or even just thought about it, I'd love to hear what your biggest challenge has been, or what system you would want to create. And if anything in Machineborn sounds interesting to you, the setting, the mechanics, the scale, let me know in the comments. And let me know if you want to see more video content related to it. I'll be releasing the game for free once it's finished, but the current version is pretty much complete and is available to Tier 1 patrons. You can access it with a 7-day free trial, which gives you more than enough time to download the latest draft. If you want to be credited as a playtester, give it a look and email me some feedback on your experiences with it, and things you would like to see change. You'll find contact details in the description. Until next time.